Picture this. A talented singer is working their way through a piece of music. Everything's going great until they hit that one note that feels too high for them. Their throat tightens, their voice strains, and what comes out sounds like a cat whose tail's been stepped on. But here is the fascinating part about this story. The note that they are struggling to hit, well, they hit it perfectly when they sing absent-mindedly in the shower, so there's no physical limitation stopping them, it's all in their head. Welcome to the Growth Mindset Psychology Podcast with me, Samuel Webster Harris. Today, the gap between what we think we can do and what we're truly capable of. We'll be learning a lot about the quirks of the human mind and how we create our own limitations, and of course, more importantly, how to break through them. So, stay tuned. The only real limits that exist upon you are those set in stone by the laws of physics. All other limitations that you live within are actually limitations controlled within your own mind. For example, it's against the law to not pay your tax, but there's no physical law of nature that will make you pay your tax. It's actually a decision within your head to do it. It's just that you have some repercussions if you don't do it. But it is totally physically possible. As Morpheus says, some rules can be bent and others can be broken. And I don't suggest not paying your taxes, but there are a lot of other limitations that exist inside your mind that I do suggest that we perhaps start bending or breaking. I wanted to spend a whole episode going into how we construct limitations in different ways and how to break them, as we are doing a bit of a mini season this January on goals and all the different ways we think about them to help you have the best year you can. So to start at the start, let's learn about how and why our brains set up all these limitations in our head. Of course, our brains are remarkable organs. They've led humanity to sending rockets to Mars, creating symphonies, or even constructing masterpieces like the Teletubbies. But another thing that brains are really good at is constructing some intricate mental barriers in places where we could easily walk right through. For example, let's talk about what's happening in your head when you face a challenge. A curious guy named Dr. Albert Bandura, who I'm sure never struggled to hit high notes in the shower, he gave us something called Self-Efficacy theory. It's a fancy way of saying that your belief in your ability to do something will dramatically affect whether you're actually able to do it. Now, I don't like getting too much into the believer achiever nonsense, because obviously believing that you can fly isn't going to start making you float off the ground whilst you're listening to this podcast episode. Sorry. However, believing that you can't do something is genuinely a certain way to fail at it. How this works in your head is that you have a security system in your brain to stop you from doing lots of things, and it's actually quite sensible. Things like jumping off cliffs, other major risks to your health, things that risk you losing assets or getting involved in something that might be embarrassing, and it really, really does want to stop you from committing social suicide. So, for example, if you grew up in Devon, putting jam on your scone before the cream would be a severe collapse of social etiquette that must never, ever be done. Of course, it's perfectly possible under the laws of physics, but it is impossible to do whilst you are in Devon. Now, the issues we run into here is that the same gating pattern that your brain uses to stop you from falling off cliffs, it uses those functions to stop you from doing things like asking for a pay raise from your boss, or starting that business you've always wanted to do, or asking that girl or guy out that you've always fancied. All these scary things have somehow fallen into the must not do laws in your mind that are actually perfectly fine for you to do. There's another curious thing about danger, and the feeling of danger we experience grows as we venture further from safety, which again is a feature of our brain that used to keep us alive. The further we venture from home without supplies, the more likely we could die, and so we turn back and we don't get lost in the forest or desert or wherever we used to live. This unconscious awareness of our safety limits was very useful, but the problem now is that we don't always have the correct awareness of where our safe limit is. Our mind establishes the concept of a safe limit as the start point, and venturing away from it is leaving your comfort zone, which is the place where you have mentally built your home. The thing is, you can actually go a long way from the perception of your comfort zone, while actually still being very safe. Asking your boss for a pay rise isn't going to get you fired. It will just create a conversation. Asking someone to go out with you won't lead to you being socially ostracized or thrown in jail. Sure, you might have an awkward conversation, but you might have a great conversation. But nothing that terrible will happen. Or starting the business you wanted to start just on the side, without quitting your job or throwing lots of money at it. It'll merely teach you some things and maybe show if that business has potential to be something you can grow further. So none of those actions have really threatened your safety in any way, but we could feel huge amounts of anxiety and lack of comfort in doing them. That's entirely due to just our brains. We start to feel some pressure, anxiety, fear. We doubt our abilities. And when we doubt our ability, we either fail by doing it badly, we don't commit, or we just don't even try and never turn up. Remember the first example of the singer choking. As they moved further from the reference point, they felt the pressure of performing. By the time they were hitting that high note, their brain was convinced that they're too far from safety and that they're going to end up screeching like some soprano bat. And that's what they do. But if they're in the shower, they're thinking about what to have for breakfast, they're chill, that note's just another note they can sing in their range, and so they sing it. So remember, if we expect to fail, we will. Even if there is no physical reason to fail. Just our own form of self-protection that's actually self-sabotaging. That's, of course, why growth mindset, expanding our comfort zones, is such an important skill and task to take on. If we can learn to embrace and love failure as part of our growth, we can remove so many of the limitations upon us. And we have to flip our own mindsets to thinking of things that feel scary as something that is actually an exciting source of growth and curiosity to explore, as opposed to something that's dangerous. Fear is wonderful when you can learn to enjoy it. But when you think it's something that's actually a dangerous threat to your health or life outcomes, it actually leads to you self-sabotaging yourself. Now, as we've been speaking about our brain security system, this leads nicely into the concept of reference points. It gets really interesting when we look at what psychologists call reference point dependence. So, for example, imagine you're watching a basketball game where the average height of a basketball player is 6'6". There's a few guys knocking on 7 foot. And when you see a player who's merely 6 foot, your brain's like, whoa, that dude's short. But he isn't. Your brain's just comparing that guy to the other dudes on the court. Of course, this 6 foot guy is actually tall, but your brain just uses reference points for how to scale things. In much the same way, if you're in Devon, you can physically put cream on your scones first if you wish, but people build their reference points from where they grow up and the people around them. Now, both those examples are mostly harmless unless you're actually in Devon and you don't want to get stabbed. But I'll give you an example that I think relates to a lot more people. The first coaching I ever did was actually meant to be me just tutoring my best mate's little sister, because I was studying biology at university. She was taking her A-levels. One of them was biology, and she was failing to get the grades she needed to get into university. The thing is, though, that I didn't actually teach her anything about biology. Her issue was that she was at a school where the highest grade any of the kids got were Ds. From her reference point, getting a B that she needed to get into university was impossible. So I didn't actually need to teach her that much about genetics or photosynthesis. I taught her that she was an A-grade student. Myself, I got 90% in all my biology A-levels, and I did that basically by locking myself in a room and cracking through past papers. And it didn't take a lot of work to convince her that she was more than smart enough to do the same thing, and she could use me as a reference point as opposed to students in a school with low performance expectations. And thus, lo and behold, 6 months later, she absolutely smashed her exams. She got all A's. She got a part-funded scholarship to her first choice university. And it was genuinely one of the proudest achievements of my life. And I honestly didn't have to do that much, but it had a huge change for her. The point here is that often it's not the details or the strategies that people are constantly seeking out. What often counts just as much or even more so is having the right reference points for yourself. To use a more widely known example, remember the 4-minute mile. Years it sat there like a brick wall in the minds of runners around the world. Doctors even wrote papers about how it could be physically impossible to run the 4-minute mile. But then, in 1954, Roger Bannister came along. He was like, hold my stopwatch, broke right through that wall, and within just a year, several other runners did too. This wall that doctors had said was physically impossible was completely in the mind. These days, modern athletes regularly run miles under 4 minutes, and they're not genetically different from runners in the 1950s. Okay, maybe they have better shoes. But the biggest thing is they don't have the mental barrier anymore, and they have increasingly higher expectations of themselves. As psychologist Carol Dweck says, after all, so much of performance is about mindset. Her research shows that people who believe their abilities can be developed will consistently outperform those who believe their abilities are fixed. Another really big source of limitations, of course, is your culture. We are designed to want to fit in and believe the same things as the people around us. In the 1950s, psychologist Solomon Asch showed that people would literally deny the evidence of their own eyes just to conform to what other people around them were saying. And he wasn't testing people's vision, he was testing their mind. And it revealed how powerfully our environment shapes what we believe is possible. It's easy to say, sure, what that experiment found doesn't apply to you. But if you think about it like this, if you grew up in Norway, going for exercise in some freezing temperatures might seem perfectly normal, whereas trying to work when it's over 30 degrees is actually very stressful. Whereas if you're in Dubai, going for a workout when it's over 30 degrees is just like another Tuesday. In fact, in the UK, people would never go camping over winter. Even when you're out mountaineering, camping would just be crazy. People look at you like you're mad. They say you're going to get ill. Your mother would be worried about you the entire time. Yet, any British person will happily then go to Nepal or Svalbard and camp out in minus 30 degrees because when you're there, that's what you do. And those examples show that our perception of impossible can often be someone else's ordinary, all entirely down to the culture and society around us. Right. On that, let's talk about one of the most fascinating experiments in human potential ever, I would personally say. The experiment lasted decades and it involved 3 little girls. In the 1960s, Laszlo Polgar, a Hungarian educational psychologist, made a very bold claim. He said that genius is made and not born. This flew in the face of people who said things like Mozart was a born genius, who was pitch perfect as a 3-year-old, etc. So what Polgar did was he decided to prove it. And he did it with a crazy idea. Before he had even had any children, he and his future wife planned to raise their kids to become chess prodigies. And when people heard this, they probably thought he was a few pawns short of a chess set. After all, everyone knows that chess grandmasters start showing natural talent from an early age, and sure, they need that to be developed, but they need the inherent talent first to be able to progress. Kind of like in the Harry Potter series, where if someone shows they're able to create magic, then they can go to Hogwarts. Otherwise, the average person is just never going to become a wizard. However, Laszlo proved when it came to becoming a chess genius, this wasn't true. His 3 daughters, Susan, Sophia, and Judith, all became chess powerhouses. Judith was the youngest, and she became the strongest female chess player in history. She beat world champions like Garry Kasparov. She reached grandmaster status at 15, which broke the infamous Bobby Fischer's previous record. These girls, of course, weren't born with some special chess gene. They simply grew up in an environment where high-level chess achievement wasn't seen as exceptional or impossible. It was just Tuesday. Whilst other kids were learning that chess was hard or only for gifted people, the Polgar sisters were learning that it was as natural as reading or riding a bike. And I think that is epic. Of course, when you hear this, some people might think that it shows that you have to learn all of the hard, crazy things as a child if you ever want to become a genius at something. So if you want to be great at chess or achieve perfect pitch or learn a language fluently, then of course you have to start as a toddler, and then that's the only way to ever reach the absolute top levels. But you're probably expecting me to say this, but that expectation is completely wrong. And it's another limitation that we place on ourselves. Now, of course, in one regards, your brain is in its most untouched state when young and has the least entrained neural pathways, etc. So it's ready to make new connections. And as we age, we become more stuck in our neural pathways. But actually, it turns out we only become as stuck as much as we allow ourselves to be. You might think that once you get old, it's impossible to learn a language with the fluency that you could have if you just learn it, if you grow up in that culture. You certainly wouldn't be able to do that in, for example, a year. However, an adult dropped in a group of humans that had zero understanding of his language, and if he had no way of talking in his own language, he would actually be able to learn the new surrounding language faster than a baby does, because if that's his only task for the next year, he can put a lot more focused work into it if it's important to him. A lot of our barriers aren't actually due to the capacity of our brain, they're just due to our environment and convenience of other options. For example, I battled to learn Spanish for years at school and I was terrible. I even took courses later on and still failed. And then finally, when I was 25, I lived in Mexico for a few months. Whilst I was there, I was still working at my job in English. But over lunch, I had a 1-hour Spanish class And then in the evening, I went to a local salsa class each night where I made friends with local people who couldn't speak English. And within 4 weeks of being there, I could spend a whole day hanging out with my Mexican friends without speaking a single word of English. Sure, it wasn't easy for me and it hurt my brain a lot by the end of the day when I did that. And yeah, my grammar probably wasn't great, but it took me 4 weeks to become a functional speaker of a language that had evaded me for years. And this rings true with what modern neuroscience says, that adult brains do remain remarkably plastic. Whilst children have some certain advantages, adults have their own secret weapons. They have better learning strategies because they've spent a lot of their life learning things. They might have stronger motivation. And then they also have a lifetime of experience in pattern recognition. We know the difference between nouns and verbs and tenses and adjectives. We know how to interpret letters and read and write them. And that's a massively unfair advantage right there compared to a toddler. So if you think that it takes a 2-year-old another 10 years to get to the language proficiency of a 12-year-old, you could do that a lot faster than 10 years as an adult. You could get to the proficiency of any native 12-year-old language speaker in less than 10 years if you wanted to. If you really value any skill, it's probably easier for you to learn that than it is for a toddler. The only thing that makes it easier for a toddler is that for you, it's inconvenient to bother. You have other priorities like working or watching Netflix, hobbies, etc. And it's just a lot of mental effort to bother. So on that, let's talk more about the concept of age barriers. There's a legend called Grandma Moses who first picked up a paintbrush seriously at 76. By the time she died at 101, her paintings were hanging in museums worldwide, and that's so awesome. If she had believed the common wisdom about being too old to start something like a career in art, then we'd have lost thousands of pieces. Another legend, if you've watched the movie Naiad on Netflix, that's the story of Diana Naiad. In her prime, she was a record-breaking long-distance swimmer. She first tried swimming 110 miles from Cuba to Florida in her 30s, but she failed terribly. Now, most people would think if they couldn't do it in their 30s, in their prime, they'd be unlikely to be able to do that later in life in their 60s. But Diana Naiad did not think that. Instead, she decided to try again in her 60s, and she continued to fail. She had 3 or 4 failed attempts before she eventually made the 110-mile long swim at the ripe old age of 64 years old, which is absolutely nuts. She spent 53 hours non-stop in the water fighting jellyfish, exhaustion, and she wasn't allowed to touch anyone or anything the entire time. The physical feat of that is absolutely nuts, and it really does prove that our capacity and limitations are not necessarily what society says they should be. Another fun fact I found whilst I was getting a little too excited on Wikipedia was Colonel Sanders was in his 60s when he finally started franchising Kentucky Fried Chicken. He drove all around the country, sleeping in his car, getting rejected over 1,000 times before someone actually said yes to his unique blend of herbs and spices, which, despite the fact that I really am not a big fan of KFC, I still can't help but admit that that's kind of cool. Also, he only started it because he was given a petrol station and he had a little side restaurant on it where he cooked all sorts of different things, one of which was a recipe for his Kentucky Fried Chicken, but he also had like ham and steaks and all sorts, and that shows the power of bothering to focus on one thing, and does show that you can start a giant monopolizing chain of restaurants later in your 60s if you wanted to. Anyway, I'm not trying to quote hustle porn at you with these examples. If you happen to be in your 60s or 70s and enjoying your life, you don't need to have some unrealistic expectations set upon you just to make you feel unhappy. I'm just giving these examples to remind people that we are often more capable than we might think we are. We will be having a pause for a quick advert break and then move on to talk about the realities of human potential, other strange barriers in our head like how age affects our thoughts at every age, and fun stuff like placebos, environment design, and turning your kids into chess grand masters. All of that coming up after the break. Let's talk about the concept of placebos. In one fascinating study, researchers told some recreational athletes that they were testing a new performance-enhancing substance that was actually just a saline solution. The crazy thing was these athletes not only subjectively felt stronger, but they actually produced measurably better results. Their bodies literally became more capable simply because their minds believed they would be. And when you think about that for a second, that means their physical limits changed because their mental limits changed. There is no actual performance enhancing drugs, or physical changes needed, just a shift in their belief. The placebo effect in general has been replicated in various outcomes beyond physical ability. It can affect people's health outcomes or even their intelligence scores. In fact, when you do a science experiment, it isn't considered valid science unless you have a test case that is using a placebo to rank that against the intervention you are testing. Because we know, for example, you can have a statistical improvement in someone's health simply by giving them a blue pill. In fact, even color of pills is important. If you give someone a red pill, it can make them feel more alert, whilst a blue or green pill can make them feel more relaxed, simply because of the color. So yes, placebos and just ideas in our head can change our abilities and our limits. Right, I have one final point I want to make, and then we're going to start going into how to put all of this into action. So final thing I want to mention is that it's really worth talking about how your environment also plays a huge factor in all of this. Sometimes the easiest way to break through your mental limits isn't to push against them, it's just to redesign your environment so the limits will never form in the first place. So you can take, for example, the Netherlands. I had no idea about this until recently, but in the 1970s, cycling wasn't actually particularly popular there. And I lived in the Netherlands where they cycle everywhere. Amsterdam is the cycling capital of the world. And so what changed between 1970 and now where it's like a profound part of their culture? Well, it wasn't human nature that changed. Certainly the weather hasn't changed and it is still awful, I can tell you that. What happened is they redesigned their cities to make cycling the easiest choice. This meant that the mental barrier of cycling is too hard, too dangerous, it's inconvenient. That never got a chance to form because the environment doesn't let that limiting belief form. The environment says cycling is the easiest thing to do. And so everyone just does that. So yes, I'm a big advocate for cycling infrastructure and how it can make cities and humans healthier. For another example of how environment can radically change how people think, you could look at Japan and their cleaning system for schools. In most countries, you hire a cleaner. In Japan, students clean their own schools. That sounds like it's a punishment or something, but in Japan, it's just part of the education. Kids grow up without forming the mental barrier between labor and things that successful people do. It's just normal and respectful to clean up. And in fact, it's a big part of their Zen belief, and the successful person should have a clean mind, and cleaning your environment is part of how you create a clean mind. And the result of all of this is that even Japanese CEOs can often be seen cleaning alongside their employees. And it's something that would seem really bizarre in other cultures, but that's just how environment can affect you. These examples both show us something really important. Often the most effective way to break through limits isn't just to fight them head on, but just to create an environment where the limit doesn't exist in the first place. Example at the moment is lots of parents are just trying to fight with their kids about using their phones all the time. And something that seems to possibly being adopted is making phones illegal in school, potentially putting social media bans on kids under 16. And if there is a big problem in society, we should look at the environment and what we allow and if we can change it, because we can. Anyway, rounding this all up and coming at you with some more personal strategies of what you can do for your own limitations, we have seen how barriers manifest and how various people have broken barriers imposed upon them. Now, how do we take this knowledge and identify and break our own mental barriers? Well, cognitive behavioral therapy gives us a really powerful tool called reframing. Instead of, for example, seeing a high note as a wall to crash into, we could see it as a playground to explore. Instead of thinking limiting beliefs like, this is my limit, we can think, this is where I'm at right now and I'm making progress. We can think that I'm relaxed and this is probably easy. And it can often make things much easier. Psychologist Gabriel Oettingen found something fascinating. Positive thinking is nice. What really works is something called mental contrasting. And it's like having a GPS for your goals. You need to know both where you want to go and where you are right now. And here's how you can put it into practice. Firstly, question your limits. If you hit a wall, you can ask yourself, is this a law of physics or just a law in my mind? So for example, maybe you get distracted a lot. Maybe you think you're a little bit or a lot ADHD and you can't fight it. Or perhaps you think you can't be a runner. Well, none of those things are laws of physics. So it must be a law in your mind. Now, the second part of this is to look for reference points. Who else has done what you're trying to do? What can you learn from them? So in the same way that I gave my tutee a new reference point to show her that she was capable of getting A's, if you're struggling to focus, There will be people out there with ADHD that have found ways to focus on the task that you're struggling with. If you're unfit, there have been plenty of unfit people who have got fit. And then you move on to number 3, and that's starting with small wins. Each tiny success that you might have can become evidence that your limits might not be where you thought they were and that you can make progress to your goal and even past it. Importantly, don't try to do the whole thing at once. So if you struggle with focus, set a timer for 5 minutes and do just that task and build it up to 10 minutes or 20 minutes and so on. If you're unfit, don't try to run a marathon next week. Start by going for longer walks and then even longer walks and slowly then start getting a bit faster. Don't do the most difficult version of the thing you want to do. Do the easiest version of it and succeed at that and build upon your successes. And don't be afraid to have small failures along the way. So here are some really good questions you can ask yourself when you face a challenge. Why do I think this is my limit? What evidence do I actually have for this being a limit? Who else has broken through similar barriers? What might this look like if it were easy? And what's the smallest step I could take to test this limit? And those would be a great set of questions to keep for journaling or diagnosing problems when you're trying to hit your goals. Remember, if you believe something is impossible, your brain will filter out any information to prove you wrong, and you'll carry on thinking it's impossible and proving to yourself that you can't do it and still failing. It's kind of like having an overprotective parent in your head who's just trying to keep you safe by keeping you small. It's a definition of a fixed mindset. But the beautiful paradox is the more you push against your perceived limits, the more that you discover that they were just that, perceptions. Like our first example of that singer who can hit impossible notes when they're not trying, some of your greatest achievements will often come when you forget to tell yourself that something is hard. So we've learned that most limits aren't due to the laws of physics. We can learn new skills. We can smash new goals at any age. The big issue is that we accumulate expectations of our capabilities from our environment and from our society. So we should learn to question what those sources are telling us and if we can change them. Improve your reference points and improve your environment. You can literally choose to do both of those things if you want. Don't live a small life confined by your fears. Live a life defined by your curiosity and explore your capability, because no one knows what you're capable of. And part of the purpose of your life is to find out. Now, if you want to learn more about the psychology of fear, we did have a series about it in the autumn of 2024 that was really worth a listen. If you want to flick back into the recent archives, I'll put some links in the notes. If you have a friend who you think has some serious potential, but just needs a nudge to be more ambitious to explore their potential, do please share this episode with them and tell them that they are actually a superstar, because that's what friends are for, and we're all in this together. Now, if you'd like to be my friend, you could hit me up with a good rating, and you can always shoot me an email or book a free call, because I do talk to anyone. If you are interested in the ad-free experience of the show, you're welcome to go premium for $5 a month. And stay tuned, as we have a lot of cool content around different psychology and mindset things that will help make this year awesome for you and to help you keep pushing on those boundaries in your head, because I'm sure you'll find they are more flexible than you thought. Remember that when we perceive a wall in front of us, it might just be a really convincing hologram projected by your well-meaning but very cautious brain. And the only way to find out is to walk through it. So good luck to you this year, and I really hope you smash through the walls of what you think you're capable of. Thank you so much for listening.
Go you!
Your consistency to reach the end of an episode is legendary.
My hero!
But when we learn things, it's important to reflect. So I politely invite you to take a pause, rifle through the biggest ideas you just heard. So here's your opportunity to hit pause and have a think. Okay, did you wrestle with some insights? Information doesn't stick when we race from one podcast to the next without using our brain to play with the knowledge. So here's another go at a pause. Alrighty, I'll let you off to continue with your life now. If you have any ideas or feedback for the show, I'm always interested to hear from you.
You're the best!
And other than that, please stay curious. Curious. Quote. Smiling for no reason.